So please join me today as I explain the Bible's major key events on Teaching the Bible.
Hello everyone, welcome back to Teaching the Bible. I'm your host Michael Koch. Teaching the Bible is a weekly television and radio program that details and explains the major events and teachings of the Bible as we move progressively through the stories of the Bible week by week. Now, the last couple of weeks we studied the kings of Israel, and we covered four major kings: King Saul, King David, King Solomon, and King Rehoboam. There's many more kings than that, but those are ones that we focused on teaching the Bible. And how we left off was the kingdom of Israel split into two kingdoms. And that was because of Solomon's great sins. God said, I will take the kingdom out of your hand, out of your son's hands. And his son was King Rehoboam, and the people of Israel came to King Rehoboam and said, your father, King Solomon, was extremely harsh on us. If you lighten the load on us, we will follow you. And he came back and said, I will be harder on you than my father, King Solomon, ever was. Well, 10 out of the 12 tribes of Israel said, well, we're not going to follow you then. And they left and they split. Now the kingdom was split in two. They became the northern kingdom of Israel, whose capital was Samaria, which might sound familiar when you think of the story of the Good Samaritan. He was from Samaria, the capital of Israel. Two tribes remained following King Rehoboam, and that would be the southern kingdom of Judah, which was made up of Judah and Benjamin. So now the kingdom of Israel was split. And what we're going to go over today are the books of Nehemiah, the books of Ezra, and the books of Esther. Now, during the times of the kings got progressively worse and worse, where they weren't following God. Instead, they turned against God, abandoned following him, and they were following other fake gods and demons and all kinds of garbage. And God finally lost his patience with them. And he warned them throughout the prophets, if you don't come back to following me, I'm going to have you conquered by a foreign power, take it away in an exile. And that's what happened. Now, the way the Bible has it chronologically laid out is a little bit out of order. What we're going to cover today are, again, I said Nehemiah, Ezra, and Esther. And they come before the prophets in the Bible, but yet what these books focus on is they lightly cover the Babylonian exile, the events, but what they focus on is God returning the Israelites back to Judah, or the people from Judah back to Judah after the Babylonian exiles are over. And he sends one man named Nehemiah to basically rebuild the city. He sends people with him to help him. It wasn't just him. And he sends another man named Ezra to be the new priest, to reteach the people who were in exile for 7 years about God. So this focuses on when the Babylonian exile is over and the people are returning, but you don't hear much about the Babylonian exile. It's kind of backwards. Later, during the times of the prophets, when we get into that, it covers the details of the Babylonian exile in depth. So let's get into it today. During the period of the kings, there were many good kings over Israel and Judah, but even more bad ones who did not follow what God instructed them to do. They ignored God's instructions and did what they wanted to do. Sometimes their actions were very sinful. Eventually, God ran out of patience with these bad kings of Israel and Judah. Israel, however, was much worse than Judah in rebelling against God and following false gods of other countries instead of our God. God warned them many times through the prophets to stop doing this, return to him, but they would not listen. Since the kings and the people of Israel, which is a northern 10 tribe, did not want to follow God's instructions, God took his help and protection away from Israel. They were conquered by the Assyrians and taken away to Assyria as captives in an exile. And they're gone for a very long time, hundreds of years. And this occurred because the people of Israel had sinned against the Lord their God, who had brought them up out of the land of Egypt from under the hand of the Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and had feared other gods and walked in the customs of the nations whom the Lord drove out before the people of Israel, in the customs that the kings of Israel had practiced. And the people of Israel did secretly against the Lord their God things that were not right. And that's said in 2 Kings chapter 17, verses 7 and 9. Some of the practices the people of Israel engaged in included sacrificing their own sons and daughters to Baal, B-A-A-L, and other false gods. And this upset our God greatly. Therefore, the Lord was very angry with Israel, and he removed them out of his sight. None was left but the tribe of Judah only. That's 2 Kings chapter 17, verses 18. So in the beginning, Israel was much worse in following false gods, and despite many God's warnings, they wouldn't stop doing it. So they were conquered and taken away to Assyria and in exile. So all that remained was the southern two-tribe kingdom of Judah. But over time, the southern two-tribe kingdom of Judah also greatly offended God by following the evil practices of the pagan nations around them. One king of Judah was particularly evil, whose name was King Manasseh. He rebuilt the temples to worship false gods and demons. He put altars to these false gods in the holy places of Judah, and he instructed the people of Judah to worship these other gods. King Manasseh burned his own son alive as a sacrifice to these other evil false gods. Wow. 2 Kings chapter 21, verses 1 to 9. As a consequence, God took his protection away from the kingdom of Judah. The kingdom of Judah was captured by the very powerful pagan king of Babylon, King Nebuchadnezzar. The people of the kingdom of Babylon were called the Chaldeans. King Nebuchadnezzar brought back to Babylon all the important and skilled people of Judah, only leaving the very poorest people behind. He also carried back to Babylon all of Judah's treasures and riches. King Nebuchadnezzar appointed a man named Zedekiah to be king over his captured territory of Judah. King Zedekiah soon rebelled against King Nebuchadnezzar. King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon and the Chaldeans invaded Jerusalem a second time because of this. They killed or captured everyone who was in the city except for the poorest of the people, who they left alone. So they left a remnant of just the poorest of the poor people that had nothing behind. And they actually took the people away twice in an exile. King Nebuchadnezzar burned all the important buildings in the kingdom to the ground, broke down the walls that surrounded Jerusalem, and carried anything of value back to Babylon. These series of events are called the Babylonian exiles, and we hear much more about them when we get into the books of the prophets. That's in 2 Kings chapter 24 and 25. Now we're going to go to the book of Nehemiah. We're going to cover Nehemiah, Ezra, and Esther. And basically, Nehemiah is a man that God stirred up the heart of the king of the Medo-Persian Empire that at that time had the Jews as captives, and stirred his heart up to let Nehemiah take a bunch of people back to rebuild Jerusalem and return the people. So Nehemiah was the man God sent back to rebuild Jerusalem. Ezra was a captive in exile that God sent back to be their new priest when Jerusalem was rebuilt and to reteach the people about God, because living in an exile, they lost, information about him. So now we're Nehemiah. When King Nebuchadnezzar of the Chaldeans captured the city of Jerusalem and carried the people of Judah off into exile into Babylon, he broke down Jerusalem's protective walls and burned down its important buildings. There was a Jewish man named Nehemiah who was still in exile under King Artaxerxes of Persia. King Artaxerxes was a king whom God inspired to allow the exiled Jews to rebuild the Jewish temple in Jerusalem and also appoint Ezra to be the high priest of the Jews there. This is extraordinary, because these were people that rebelled against the Babylonian Empire, which is now the Medo-Persian Empire, and they went in and captured them and took them as captives. And back then they didn't decide for no reason, these people that we conquered and took as captives, I think as king, I'm going to let them all go back home. And not only am I going to let them all go back to their old home, I'm going to pay for everything, to rebuild everything. Whatever they need, I'll give them the money. They didn't do that. That was God inspiring these kings to do that for the Jews, because God wanted the Jewish people to return after the exiles. Nehemiah was the cupbearer to King Artaxerxes. Nehemiah heard that for the remnant of his people still living back in Jerusalem, which was the poorest of all the people that were just left there, the wall of the city remained torn down and its gates were destroyed. Remember, Nehemiah was a Jew in exile in the pagan empire, and he heard what was left of his hometown, which is still destroyed, and there was nothing but the poorest of the poor there. Nehemiah prayed to God that God would fix this situation. While Nehemiah was serving the king as cupbearer, the king noticed that Nehemiah looked sad. King Artaxerxes said to Nehemiah, "Why is your face sad, seeing you are not sick? There's nothing but sadness in your heart." That's Nehemiah 2, verses 2. That is a risky thing when a king says that to you, and I'll tell you why. Because back then, if you didn't look happy in front of the king, if you looked upset or miserable or something, The king was a little paranoid that you might be plotting to hurt the king. So you better look happy in front of the king. So for the king to say to you, why do you look so miserable? If he didn't say the right thing, he might have been killed. And Nehemiah became very afraid at this. However, he gathered up his courage and he said to the king, let the king live forever. Why should not my face be sad? When the city, the place of my father's graves, Jerusalem, lies in ruins, and its gates have been destroyed by fire. And he said that in Nehemiah chapter 2, verse 3. So the king asked Nehemiah what he wanted from him. Nehemiah humbly asked the king if he could send Nehemiah back to Judah so he could rebuild his homeland. The king asked him how long he would be gone and when he would return. When Nehemiah told him how long he thought it would take for him to do this, the king granted Nehemiah's request. It's kind of unheard of. The king also wrote letters to rulers of the territories under his domain to give Nehemiah the building materials he would need to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem and parts of the city. And the king granted me what I asked, said Nehemiah, for the good hand of my God was upon me. So God was causing all this to happen. That's Nehemiah chapter 2, verse 1 to 8. So God moved the heart of King Artaxerxes of the Chaldeans to allow his captured cupbearer, Nehemiah, to return to his destroyed homeland of Judah to rebuild it, and the king said he would fund all of it. Nehemiah gathered a group of Jewish men, and they began to rebuild the walls and gates of Jerusalem that had been destroyed by King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon earlier. They encountered opposition and threats of violence from several people who did not want the Israelites to rebuild Jerusalem. Nehemiah and his men also faced oppression from local officials as they worked. Throughout this, they prayed to God for guidance and protection, and God provided both for them. With God's help, it took Nehemiah and his men only 52 days to rebuild the wall around the entire city of Jerusalem. The enemies of Jews rebuilding the wall were astounded that it only took them 52 days to rebuild it. They realized that God was helping them do this. So out of fear of God, they no longer tried to stop the Jews from rebuilding Jerusalem. Now, although the wall around the city was now complete, there were only a few people living within Jerusalem, and none of the houses that were destroyed by King Nebuchadnezzar were yet rebuilt. That's in Nehemiah chapters 3 to 6. Shortly after the wall around Jerusalem was rebuilt, 42,360 people returned from the Babylonian exile back to the areas of Jerusalem and Judah, along with approximately 7,500 male and female servants. God moved the hearts of the Israelites' captors to allow the Israelites to leave their kingdom and return back to their home. All the people gathered together, and Ezra, the scribe and priest, we're going to hear more about him next, read the book of the law of Moses to them. Remember, they're in captivity, and they didn't hear about God in this pagan country. They had to be retaught about our God. Nehemiah became the governor of the area. Jewish religious worship practice to God finally began once again in the areas of Jerusalem and Judah after the Babylonian exiles came to an end. That's in Nehemiah chapter 7 to 13. So see, Ezra was the priest of the people that returned and retaught them about God, and Nehemiah was the governor and the man who headed the rebuilding of the city of Jerusalem. So now we're going to read about Ezra.